We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abbie Show.
Hello and welcome to episode 10 of The Kate and Abbie Show. How cool is that?
Wow, yay.
Dang.
We said we're going to celebrate, but we don't have anything to celebrate.
I am celebrating with this here mason jar of water.
I am celebrating with this here mason jar of dirty chai latte, which is mostly coffee, which is shocking.
It's what's even more shocking than that is the fact that you're drinking a coffee when I am not. And I was very close to almost having a coffee, and then I decided, you know what? I should probably just hydrate my body with some nice, pure spring water here. So here I am.
I'm pretty shook that you don't have coffee right now.
I know, especially for this celebratory episode. But thank you guys for being here and for supporting the podcast by listening for 10 episodes. Dang. And if you're just finding this podcast, welcome. Maybe this is the first episode you're listening to. We talk about all things writing, storytelling, and creative wellness. So we're all about having happy, healthy, creative lives, staying stoked, rocking on, chasing our dreams as creatives, and manifesting our own creative light. So that's what this podcast is all about. That's what we talk about. It's everything from writing books to storytelling to films to all kinds of different creative endeavors. But a lot of it seems to trace back to writing since we are both writers. So yeah, that's a little bit about who we are. Welcome. If you're just here, if you're just popping in for the first time, today is going to be a really fun episode because we are talking about, and this is, I think, part of the celebration. We chose a topic that we love so much to celebrate episode 10. Learning storytelling principles from the Chronicles of Narnia. Yay! One of our favorite series of all time.
Yeah, for sure.
Both in the literary, the book version, and obviously, the original book. And we love the films as well.
Yeah.
We love everything involving this series. So
it's great.
We're going to delve into that. We're going to be talking about principles that are found in the book, but if you're watching this episode on YouTube, it's available on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/KAMNs. You'll be able to watch the episode if you'd so like, and I would recommend watching for this story mining episode because I insert quite a bit of B-roll of the examples we're going to be using the film examples for the nice visual factor for you guys.
Yeah, you guys, you have to watch the videos for the story mining episodes, just like pro tip. We say the same thing in the podcast version, but it's just not as dynamic because Katie does a great job editing those videos. So this is one of those videos.
Yep.
It's definitely entertaining. It's very entertaining. So
yeah, I have a ton of fun editing these episodes, even though it takes me a very long time because I keep thinking of I want to pull that in, I want to pull that in, so you can have the visual of what we're talking about, especially if you haven't necessarily seen a film that we're mentioning. A lot of times I'll pull a nice variety of clips so you can kind of get a bit of the flavor of what we're talking about. So if you haven't checked out the previous couple of story mining episodes, do so. Those will be linked below in the description. If you're listening on another podcast format, just scroll back and you'll find those pretty easily. Story mining episodes are episodes in which we dig into specific stories and mine them for all the goodies, all the goodness about storytelling. And we use examples, both good examples, bad examples. It's about just analyzing story and seeing what works, what doesn't, how it works, and why it makes us feel something or maybe not.
Exactly. Because learning from watching stories, reading stories is the best way, in my opinion, to learn storytelling.
I agree. It is. It's that's really the best way to learn. So today we're digging into the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah. So I know we mentioned a few things earlier when we were discussing what we were going to discuss. One of those things being what is at the heart of, in my opinion, every great story, and I talk about this a ton on my channel, which is internal conflict. And I feel like whenever I think about Narnia, I think about the first movie, or the first, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the first thing that comes to my mind. But also the others. But there is such good internal conflict that is introduced right away, right out of the gate with the first story in the series, that I think it just grabs you in such a engaging way that you don't even really need to know a lot about these kids that you're introduced to before you start to immediately care about them, especially Lucy, because we follow her the most.
Right. We're seeing the world through her eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, so from your perspective, where do we start to see the first glimpses of the internal conflict that's going to carry throughout the story? That's going to carry us through the story, rather.
Really, in the first scene with the Blitz, the scene where they're running out of the house, the whole interchange, the whole conversation between Peter and Edmund is really the first glimpse of conflict that you start to see.
Why can't you like anyone but yourself? You're so selfish. You could have got us killed.
Stop it!
Why can't you just do as you're told?
Peter's kind of like the dad character. He's not the dad, obviously, but he thinks he is, and kind of tries to fill that role and is a bit bossy with his younger siblings, especially Edmund. And you can see that Edmund is pretty angsty and doesn't like that.
Oh, isn't it time you were in bed?
Yes, Mum.
Ed.
And you can also see that Edmund is kind of a softie at heart, because he goes back to get the picture of their dad, and then he's obviously doesn't like being told what to do by Peter. So there's this little sibling angst going on right away. And then Lucy is just kind of the cinnamon roll character,
Right,
who's being tossed around, but you care about her because you understand her feelings, and you really I think it really encapsulates well how she feels being thrown into this new, she's not totally against it, but also is it's a whole new, they all get kind of shoved outside their comfort zone,
right,
in the first 5 minutes.
right. So you would probably kind of identify that as the hook.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, so we have the Pevensey kids shoved outside their comfort zone. Now they're living in the country. They're staying at this guy, Professor Kirk's house. Lucy finds the wardrobe. We were discussing how this is kind of an interesting example for the inciting incident, because there's kind of 3 inciting incidents that grouped together make the ultimate inciting incident.
Yeah.
Which I guess if you want to call them going to the country the hook, then, you could probably say that's slightly separate, but it's also them going to the country is part of the inciting incident too.
Because you can also see how it shows them outside of their comfort zone.
Right.
And so that's really how I define the inciting incident.
Right.
But it's also setting up who the characters are and the world that they live in, even though
and what their personalities are like. It kind of shows their personality roles really, really well,
for sure,
very quickly.
Yeah, with not any exposition. There's just that one conversation with Edmund and Peter, and then when they're at the train station, you kind of get the gist of who, what they're all like based on how the mom talks to them and how they respond, and then they don't really talk for the rest of the opening credits until they're at the house.
Right.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is, for sure. So much is communicated by face expression and just the way they're handling it silently, just what's communicated through there. But then, then you have the second inciting incident, which is Lucy finding the wardrobe and the wood in the wardrobe and meeting Mr. Tumnus and going to team. And then she comes back. And then you have the third inciting incident of Edmund also finding Narnia and then meeting the witch, which really
kind of does like double duty as the first pinch point too.
Right.
Which is so interesting because it's not really in the place where you normally put a pinch point, like for the 3-act story structure, which I've like studied this so much trying to figure out like how it falls into the 3-act story structure. And it doesn't really, I mean, it definitely has like the acts. You can definitely like find the 3 acts if you look for them. But the beginning is like full of these really interesting hooks that push the characters outside their comfort zone and pull you in like even more each time. And so it's really interesting with that plot point where Edmund goes into Narnia, he meets the witch, and there's a little bit of like, she's obviously the antagonist, so there's going to be like, so that's kind of like that reminds me of a pinch point because she's the antagonist. You know that she's going to end up being not a good character. And
right, and then you have the conversation piece where he mentions, oh, you know, Lucy met Tumnus, blah, 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 which now you know that something bad's going to happen now. So that's kind of like a looming danger sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
You call it something else. Is it looming danger? Like
impending doom.
Yes, impending doom. So that's like your first little taste of that is, you know, ooh, there's something kind of eerie about this lady and something bad's going to happen to the fawn that Lucy met.
Yeah.
So
plus you also have like Edmund's internal conflict showing through there of like he doesn't really like he wants the witch tempts him basically, and he doesn't really he's kind of pretentious. Like he thinks he's better than the rest of his siblings.
Edmund, I would very much like to meet the rest of your family. Why?
As he says, they're nothing special. And he like wants the witch kind of tempts him with this idea of like, well, you could be the king of Narnia, blah blah blah.
You could have more Turkish delight.
You could have whole rooms full of Turkish delight. And so he's like, okay, yeah, I'm totally ready to sacrifice my siblings to get that.
Right.
So, but you can still see that he's a good character at heart, but he's gonna go through quite a character arc.
Right. Yeah, he's interesting because he's like a shallow and deep character at the same time.
Yeah,
like he's so shallow that he's
so
like,
much.
I will sell my family for Turkish delight. But he also has a lot of like deep-seated emotional things he's dealing with. And he has a lot of good internal conflict as a character. So it's kind of interesting, his dynamic he has going on there. A little bit of like tug of war aspect going on.
Honestly,
his great.
His character arc is my favorite out of all of them.
Yeah, because of that.
Yeah, and because it just goes on he just has such an interesting transformation. And I just really like his character. It's very, like you said, he seems shallow at first, but he's actually quite a deep character.
Yeah, he is.
Very cool.
I agree. So you have, we were talking about the fact that, you have this great kind of like triple, like formed into one inciting incident.
And then there's the part where they go into Narnia.
Right.
All of them.
Right, that's true.
And then they find that, because Lucy's like, oh, we need to go meet Mr. Tumnus. They go there, and then they find that Mr. Tumnus has been kidnapped.
Right, so you could almost say that's...
Yeah, so that's really like part of the inciting incident as well, because they thought everything's okay. It's like, this is weird, but everything's okay. And now suddenly it's like, oh, something bad happened, and it's kind of Edmund's fault in a way.
Right.
But it pushes them outside their comfort zone again, even more, and prompts them to make a decision, which kind of leads to like the first plot point. Yeah. So like all of this really happens technically before the first plot point.
Right. Which the first plot point, like you would say, is what?
Would be the part where they pretty much decide to stay in Narnia and get Edmund back and understand the prophecy and how it relates to them.
Right.
Because that's really the first plot point is like, the protagonist makes a decision that in response to the inciting incident pushing them outside their comfort zone. So after analyzing it, it seems like the only premeditated decision they make is to stay in Narnia and see like what the prophecy is about. But also part of the reason why they do that is because Edmund leaves and goes to the witch's castle.
Right.
So that kind of also like forces them to stay. So it's like all this really interesting conflict going on.
I think you've made a mistake. We're not heroes.
We're from Finchley. Thank you for your hospitality. But we really have to go.
You can't just leave.
Yeah, it is. And so then we were talking about how, so you have this inciting incident that's kind of this really complex inciting incident, and then everything from there is really like cleanly related to the inciting incident without any sort of, without being muddled at all.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And so like you were talking about how the cause and effect is really consistent in this storyline.
Yeah. Because it goes like right from everything like has a direct cause and effect, and it really wastes no time with it either. There's like not all these distractions going on the side. It really just follows this one storyline of, you know, when Lucy goes in the wardrobe, she obviously leaves, which leads to them trying to figure out how to get back into it. Nobody believes her, which leads to her going in by herself, which leads to Edmund following her, which leads to Edmund meeting the witch, which leads to them eventually coming back out again, which leads to confusion amongst the siblings, which leads to the whole conversation with Susan and Peter and Professor Kirk about the wardrobe. Which the next day I think it's the next day they go back into the wardrobe, and it's like they all get into the wardrobe, and then that like immediately sets off the next string of events.
Right.
So it's all like very smooth and uninterrupted.
Yeah. It has also a nice slow escalation too.
Yeah.
Because I mean it's like it starts with, okay, you know, Lucy meets a fawn, then Edmund meets a witch, now someone gets kidnapped, now Edmund runs away, and it's like on and on and on until it's like, and then Aslan dies, and then there's a battle, and it's like just
it just like escalates from there. But it's so interesting because it starts, and we were talking about this earlier, it starts really simple. Like the premise itself is very small and simple. Like just Lucy finds a magical land in the back of a wardrobe. She meets one character. She travels in like maybe a 100-foot radius of the point of entry. And then she goes back into the real world. It's like not much happens in that first scene, which we were talking about how awesome the world building is.
Right. Yeah. I definitely want to touch on that. Yeah. So I think the cause and effect and how beautifully laid out it is throughout the story also helps to escalate the internal conflict, and all the same thing kind of goes for the internal conflict in the story, in that the way it escalates, the way it plays out feels kind of like that same principle carried over. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so you see that with Edmund's,
right,
as the story goes on, and it kind of leads to his character transformation.
Yeah. Right. You're saying like it escalates, and you learn more as time goes on. You learn more about the characters and their relationships with each other.
Yes.
Yeah. And I find that really interesting too, and how it's like when it starts, you don't really need like this info dump, or you don't really need like even backstory about these characters, because you like immediately know, you are shown the relationship that they have with each other.
Right. And I guess what I was trying to say was that you see like why Edmund makes the decisions he makes based off of his own internal conflict, which is mostly fueled by his relationship with Peter and his other siblings, and the way he looks at himself.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's all like rooted in his misbelief.
Right.
And that's really the basis of all good internal conflict, which makes the plot points and everything that's going to happen in the plot itself more interesting, because you're now anticipating how are they going to react to it based on their misbelief, based on who they are as a character. It's no longer like, oh, well, my mirror neurons are just firing because, you know, if this was me, I would be scared or whatever.
Right.
You know, you care about it because you care about the characters.
Right. Right. And you can understand what it feels like to maybe deal with like everyone I can relate to like feeling insecure or feeling like, the need to feel like worthy and capable. And that's so communicated really well. And you see why he ultimately makes the decisions he makes based off of his misbelief that like his brother is kind of always like lording it over him, that like, oh, I can tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And so that little conflict that you see so well, how it's like it eats away at him, that's part of what fuels what he does. So I think too, you have an awesome internal conflict with these same characters in the second book, Prince Caspian, also the second film, Prince Caspian. It's portrayed very well. The internal conflict that Caspian is experiencing, and also that Peter is experiencing. And I think it's so worth noting, and I know you get asked this question a lot, is number one, like how to find your character's misbelief and how unique does it need to be? And does every character need to have a different misbelief? And I think the answer to that is no, they don't. And you had some really interesting stuff to say about the fact that Peter and Caspian's misbeliefs about themselves that they're dealing with throughout this story is very similar. Basically the same type of internal conflict that each is facing.
Yeah, it is really interesting because you wouldn't think like you could write a story with two characters getting so much of the screen time, so to speak, who have the same internal conflict, really, without it feeling like, oh, you just copied and pasted that character. Like, they are not copied and pasted. Like, they're so different from each other, but they're also very much the same. And I think that's what leads to a lot of the conflict and strife between them in their relationship, is that they are very similar.
Right.
Which, in my opinion, I've seen that more often than the opposite. And I find it more riveting than the opposite. It's like to have two characters that are kind of rivals.
Right.
That are more similar than they are different.
All right, which we kind of pointed out too, I think, back in the first story minding episode when we talked a bit about how Ross Poldark and George Warlegan, who, if you don't know the series, is the villain character, have very similar personalities, and even like some of their internal conflict is similar.
Yeah.
Sort of, kind of. So it's like, and that's part of what makes it so good, and their dynamic so good, and just the whole chemistry between those two characters' rivalry is like really good because of the fact that their misbelief or their internal conflict is very similar.
Yeah, and their personalities are very similar as well.
So like, Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, what you also see between like Peter and Caspian.
Yeah.
Is that there's like, basically the internal conflict there that I see is that Caspian has this misbelief of like not being worthy. And that's kind of like his character arc, is that he sort of comes to see and have an aha moment that he is worthy to be not only, King of Narnia or whatever he ends up being, but also to see himself in a different way.
Right.
And kind of understand his identity better. But also, Peter seems to be struggling with the same thing. Because he's like the High King. Right. So you have like right away, it's like Prince Caspian is supposed to be like the king of the Talmarines, but then his uncle like wants him dead. And then like Peter is the actual High King of Narnia. So it's like this rivalry right away just from that. But also from their internal conflict, which is like this sense of insecurity, this sense of not feeling worthy or not feeling like capable enough. And that's like, why they have so many disagreements over like what to do as far as like the plans, battle tactics, everything going forward into the plot itself. And like disagree on everything because of that, because they're like really both trying to prove themselves to themselves, but also to everybody else.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of why you have such great conflict between the two of them that makes the story so intriguing and acts as an engine to fuel a lot of the story, such as the battle that goes wrong, the invasion of the castle.
Yeah.
Which then leads to a bunch of people end up dying. A bunch of Narnians end up dying.
Right.
Because of this little, like, rivalry kind of getting out of hand.
Yeah.
Peter has this idea about, like, we should do the plan this way. Caspian is, like, not really jiving with it.
Our only hope is to strike them before they strike us.
But that's crazy. No one has ever taken that castle.
There's always a first time.
We'll have the element of surprise.
But we have the advantage here.
And Peter's like, nope, we're going to do it this way because this is, I want to prove myself. And Caspian's kind of dealing with a little bit of a similar thing, but it kind of shows where it really gets to Peter and he kind of pushes through with his plan, which then turns into a giant disaster.
Peter! It's too late! We have to pull it off while we can!
No, I can still do this! Help me!
Exactly who are you doing this for, Peter?
Kind of, would you say, is like a pinpoint? Kind of, yeah. Right?
Which part?
The battle that goes bad.
That's really at the midpoint, so
Okay.
I think it would probably be the game-changing midpoint.
Okay.
Is what I would call it, because it does kind of change a lot of things.
Right.
But it's also a really extended sequence.
Yeah, it is.
It's like 20 minutes long or something.
Yeah, it's very long. It takes up a lot of time in the film.
It's so good though.
It is.
Can we just appreciate how amazingly edited and choreographed and the music,
amazing. All
the
of
CGI,
it, so
everything,
good. Everything about it is amazing. My favorite film ever, by the way. So how cool is it that not only can you have two lead characters that have basically the same sort of internal conflict, but you can also use that to create a huge external conflict that then helps to propel the entire story arc forward.
Yeah.
Because really, the rivalry and the tension between Peter and Caspian, like I just said about the battle that goes bad, and also just proceeding forward from there, fuels a lot of the story.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I love also how they have some conflict from the conflict between Peter and Edmund. I mean, it's way toned down from the first story, but it's still there. And I love the whole relationship between them in Prince Caspian and how all of that has evolved. And there's just some interesting elements of Peter trying to prove himself and Edmund kind of just quietly being a boss because he's kind of already had his aha moment in the first story.
Right.
And so it's kind of interesting, the different character arcs happening at different times during the timeline. I mean, Edmund still has his own character arc and character development in Prince Caspian, but mostly it was in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so he kind of has already overcome to some degree where Peter is still struggling.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. So it's so can your characters have basically the same internal conflict or misbelief? Yeah.
Yeah.
And not only that, but it can actually be really cool.
Oh, I was going to say about that is that I think one of the distinctions that you can make if you want to have two characters with the same internal conflict, but you don't want them to come across seeming like a copy and pasted character, I think the biggest marked difference between Peter and Caspian, for this example, is their backstory and where the misbelief came from. So, in Caspian's case, his misbelief really came from his backstory in how his father died mysteriously, which he later finds out was, spoiler alert, his uncle killed his father. Conveniently. They always do.
I was going to say, it's always the evil uncle takes over the
evil
kingdom
uncle always does something
killing
bad.
the king.
Yeah, so having that inferiority complex and his backstory being what it is and how Miraz kind of always throws that in his face, at least towards the second half.
To have stopped you, but you are not like me, are you? It's sad. The first time you've shown any backbone. And it's such a waste.
Right.
When Caspian goes into his room when they're raiding the castle, and then they kind of get into like a little bit of a disagreement, and that makes things go south. But
Right.
also later during the duel, when he's like has the chance to kill Miraz but doesn't.
Right.
And how there's just like a backstory and relationships in Caspian's life that are very unique to him. And then with Peter, it's all very unique to his story. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like his backstory is completely different. He obviously did not like grow up in Narnia, even though he did in the previous, but that's kind of part of the story. I feel like I'm being really incoherent, but that's part of the story, is that like he spent in The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, they all like grew up in Narnia and had like separate lives in Narnia, and then they came out of Narnia and they're suddenly kids again. And Peter it kind of shows like how he couldn't really get past that.
I mean, don't you ever get tired of being treated like a kid?
We are kids.
Well, I wasn't always. It's been a year.
Right.
Because like in the very beginning when he's fighting in the subway, he's like, I wasn't always a kid, and like none of them, like all of them were,
exactly.
All of them ended up being kings and queens, and they were adults in Narnia. But like Peter like can't get over the fact that he was once this great king, and now he's back to being a normal kid.
Exactly.
So like that's where his
so he kind of developed an inferiority complex from that,
from Caspian. You know what I'm saying? Like their backstories are like night and day, and I think that's what makes them feel so unique, even though they have the same kind of internal conflict.
Exactly. Yeah. So that absolutely is a completely different flavor, and it has a completely different complex backstory to go with it, even though it's like very similar, like basically the same misbelief, but rooted from a different place, which only adds another layer of like complexity to the story itself.
Yeah, it's great.
So the world building in Narnia is something that you can't really miss. That's basically the backbone of the book and the movies, the films that were based off the books. Like the world building is what makes the experience. It's what makes us want to go live there. And the world building is absolutely incredible in the Chronicles of Narnia. And I think the way that I think a lot of people have questions about world building as writers, and I've had so many people ask me before, and I'm sure you've had the same thing, is that like, what's the best way to like introduce a world if you're writing a fantasy, especially? Like, okay, you've crafted this whole fantasy world. Now, how do you like introduce it in such a way that you're like drawing your readers or your viewers right in, and they're engaged and they understand the world? Now, I think the two big fears that a lot of people have is that it will be like an overwhelming amount of information to take in, and that it will be confusing, or that they won't care about it because they don't know the magic system and how the government works and all of that stuff that feels like it's really important to let everybody know about before they really enter the world. But really, in Narnia, C.S. Lewis did not abide by any of the, not so much rules, but sort of the norm you see in a lot of modern fantasies that have lots of info overload at the very beginning, letting you know what the world is like, how the government runs, or if it's like a fantasy, not urban fantasy, like how more of a high fantasy, then how the magic system works, if there's magic involved. And C.S. Lewis shows us so artfully in Narnia in the series how you really don't need many details about the world to care about it. And like you were saying, in the first book, in the first film as well, when Lucy enters Narnia, she explores like what you said, like 100-foot radius of the place. We know nothing about it. except for the fact that, oh, it's called Narnia. Every tree, icicle, every piece of snow is Narnia.
Yeah.
And here's a fawn. I live here, and he's the only character you meet. You go to his house for tea, and you go back to the spot by the lamppost.
Yeah.
And that is all.
Yeah.
We don't know about the witch. We don't know about the whole conflict. We don't know about Aslan. We don't know about the fact that there's talking animals. Like, we don't know any of it.
Yeah.
So none of that is introduced to us, but yet we are super engaged.
Right. And I think that's the reason why you're engaged, is because it starts so small. It's so it's a perfect example of deep point of view, which a lot of writers strive to write in deep point of view, which is basically the concept that you never leave the character's mind for a moment, and it's so immersive because you feel like you are living inside the skin of the character. And to achieve that, you have to stay inside the limits of what the character knows and what they are experiencing with their senses in the moment. So for that, Narnia is a great example. And I actually made a video a few months ago, about how to world build. And I used Narnia as an example because it's such a great example of this small scale world building, in that we're following Lucy, we're seeing it through Lucy's eyes, and it adds to the wonder and curiosity that you feel towards Narnia and towards the wardrobe and everything that she encounters, because you're looking at it through her eyes and you don't know anything more than what she knows. You never know more about Narnia than what the characters find out when they find it out. Mm-hmm. And it's not, like you were saying, you know, if you looked at the full scale of everything that you have there, there's actually quite a lot of moving parts, a lot of different elements of it, and a lot of backstory revolving around Aslan and the witch, and like, why is it winter eternally?
Right.
You know, and they don't go into any of that. It's like briefly mentioned when she goes to see Tumnus, and he doesn't really explain why any of it is the way it is. Mm-hmm. But you don't need to know, because you're learning the information as she's learning it. So you're really like deep inside her point of view. And I think that's the biggest reason why it feels so engaging.
Yeah. And like you said, immersive is the perfect word for it. It feels completely immersive, and like you're experiencing everything through Lucy's eyes. And never at any moment are you like, oh, I wish they would just like stop for a second and explain like, how did Jadis get her powers? Like, what can she do exactly? Do the curses get like broken? And if so, how? And like, okay, how did Aslan become who he is? And when they talk about like the deep magic at the beginning of time, well, like, what does that mean? How was this magic distributed? What are the laws? They talk about like the rituals and the laws. What are those exactly? Can they be explained to us? We never have any of these questions. We don't care about them. And if they were included, they would be kind of boring, and they would slow down the entire story.
And they would also make you feel disconnected from the main characters. Exactly. Because they don't know any of this.
Right.
And so, and even if they did, even if they all went, you know, into Narnia the first time, and Tumnus just like dumped all this exposition on them about how everything works and the witch and Aslan and everything, you would be like, okay. Right. You'd feel kind of overwhelmed with information, and it would not really pull you in anymore.
Right.
And I think it pulls you in even more to have the information that's necessary be trickled out when it becomes necessary to know it.
Exactly. Right. Which I think, like, for a lot of fantasy writers, I mean, like, it can be, if you're not writing something that's like high fantasy, maybe it's more urban fantasy, and it's like, well, how do I lay out you know, the government, or, you know, let's say it has something very specific to do with, you know, okay, people live in a certain way, or whatever. There's some technical piece of a thing, like a technology that needs to be explained or no one will get it. Think of, instead of just telling it straight out in exposition, how could you have me see it through the character's eyes? In my series, The Blood Race, that's how I weave into the story. You kind of are seeing the world building in the dimension through Ion's eyes when he goes there, and he's completely clueless and doesn't really know what he's looking at. And you as the reader don't really know, except for the glimpses you've seen from Hawk's point of view. And even then, you're never getting like info dumped of like, here's the world, here's how it works, here's how we interact with other people. You're kind of just seeing like a very straightforward point of view of like, here's what's happening. And you're kind of like, ooh, now I'm intrigued because I know there's something there and I've seen glimpses of it. And a lot can be described also through visuals. So if it's like just the world itself, you want to describe how it looks, then, you know, just as the character's seeing it, we don't even need really exposition for that. And then if there's like a certain magic system or whatever, let it be displayed as you go. In the blood race, that's sort of unfolded through Ion's own powers and his inability to understand why he has them. That leads into, okay, how does he have these powers? The sliders have these powers because, and then it sort of is slowly fed out through the story, but as the character is experiencing things. And I've found that for me, I wrote it that way because that's what felt natural to me as the writer. That was how I was like seeing it unfold in my head. And I think if you can stay almost more analog like that, that helps you to stay in that deep point of view and just experience it through the character. How are they puzzled over it? That's okay for the reader to be puzzled with them. They're learning with the character. It's much better than feeling either info dumped or like the character knows way more than they do and none of it's being told at all. It's kind of this happy medium where the reader doesn't know everything and the character doesn't know everything either, which is the place where we meet Lucy in the beginning. She knows nothing of Narnia. We know nothing of Narnia. And we slowly learn through Lucy and eventually through the rest of the Pevensey children.
Right.
And I think that's just such a brilliant way to make the reader feel connected to the character right off the bat, as opposed to like the example that comes to my mind is like, and you use this as an example in a video, in the beginning of Divergent, we hear an exposition about the world and how the factions
they say the war was terrible,
from the disembodied
that the rest
voice
of the world
Triss.
was destroyed. Our founders built the wall to keep us safe, and they divided us into 5 groups, factions. The smart ones are an erudite. Amity farm the land. Candor value honesty. And then there's Dauntless. My faction is abnegation.
And now we sort of feel like the character knows all this stuff that we don't know, so we don't feel really connected to her as a character. And we don't learn as we go. We just sort of have it all handed to us. So it feels like it could have been more artfully woven in through dialogue that she has with her brother. It could have been woven in through the beginning pieces of dialogue that follow that. So it kind of shows you like how that can come off feeling a bit flat to a lot of people. Whereas if you rewrote that, didn't have any exposition on the front end of that film. I say film because I have not read the books, but you read the book.
Yeah, it's very, very similar.
Right. So imagine that restructured in that we don't hear any of that exposition and we just start seeing it through Triss's eyes as she goes through having to choose what faction she's going to be in. It would all become quite obvious what's happening and would actually be more engaging than just having it all handed to us.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of a dystopian example. So this works for any type of genre. But I think that C.S. Lewis did such a fabulous job in the Chronicles of Narnia, keeping us really small-scale world building to start with. And then that naturally leads into expanding the world slowly as the character goes deeper and deeper into that world.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And I like that you mentioned your book because I was going to bring up your book because you do such a great job world building. And another thing that came to my mind when you were talking about it was that you really first see, I know you go into Hawk's point of view a little bit in the beginning, but you really first start to see this world from Ion's perspective. And everything that happens to him, everything that leads into like explanation of how the world works, it all somehow matters to him.
Right.
Like it's never just like Hawk starts, dumping on him about like
various things, and okay, we can do this and we can do that and blah, blah, blah. It's like all how it relates to him.
Right.
Because he has these mysterious powers that he doesn't understand. So he wants to know, like, okay, why does this matter to me?
Exactly.
And he has kind of a cynical approach to it as well, of like not really wanting to be a part of this at first, which makes it even more, I think, hones the focus even more to make it important to him, and just goes into how does it matter to him? And I think if you always stay on the path of why does it matter to this main character who's experiencing it, you really can't go wrong, because it will never derail and you'll never really get distracted with unnecessary information.
Right.
Because the reader is living in the skin of the character. So if you pull that off by getting the reader into the skin of the character, into the mind of the character, you don't want them to leave. You don't want them to like become disembodied from this character and detached because they're now learning just random information about the world. It feels like reading the author's notes is the only thing I know how to compare it to, which just doesn't, it's disconnected from the character, and it's also, it just makes you not care as much.
Right. Because what's important is how it's going to affect the main character.
Right.
Like in Narnia, I mean, the only reason Narnia matters is because it's going to deeply affect and change the lives of the Pevensey children.
Right.
So what we learn about the world building as it's affecting them, not before. Because if we knew before, number one, it would deflate the story and take away it's almost like a type of suspense.
Yes.
It kind of deflates that because we already know everything.
Yeah. Which I would like to add is, like, I talked about suspense in my videos before and how there's like different types of suspense, and there's like shared suspense, and then there's vicarious suspense. And vicarious suspense, a lot of writers might think that this falls into the category of vicarious suspense, is like knowing information that the characters don't know. But it really doesn't. It doesn't work that way with world building, because it's not a suspenseful thing that's going to happen. It's not an event that's going to take place. It's not an antagonist plotting behind closed doors. It's not an opposition that's looming in the distance. It's just information. Mm-hmm. There's nothing suspenseful about information that we literally do not need to know, because otherwise it's not really important. Mm-hmm. It just makes you feel like detached and distant from the characters, and that like you read a Wikipedia page about the setting of the book before you get to meet the characters.
Right.
It's just like information. It's not a plot point or a disaster or an antagonist plotting some kind of thing behind the scenes.
Right.
It's not a bomb being placed under the table.
Right.
To use the Alfred Hitchcock analogy.
Right.
It's just information.
Right. So it's kind of more suspenseful in a lot of cases to just leave it as unknowns. And then with the little bit of unknownness, it adds some mystery and intrigue, might even be a better word to describe it.
Yeah.
To the story rather than it's all just spelled right out in the beginning.
Yeah. Which actually there is vicarious suspense in both Narnia examples we were just talking about, in the first one and in Prince Caspian. In the first one, even though one of the characters is involved, Edmund is involved, you see everything happening with the antagonist through Edmund's perspective, but the other kids don't really know what's happening there.
Right.
So that's kind of vicarious suspense, in that you're following Edmund, so you see what's happening with the witch behind closed doors, but the other kids don't know about it. So you're kind of going into their perspective, and you're like, oh, I know that something bad's going to happen, because like you see the wolves going off to attack them, and they don't know about it yet, but like it's going to happen. And so there is like this sense of impending doom. Same with Prince Caspian, because the Telmarines are like plotting all this stuff. Miraz is plotting to get Caspian and capture him and kill him eventually. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't know that. Or he does, and he's running away.
Right.
But he doesn't know like what's going on back at the palace. And so you get to go back to the palace, and you get to see what's going on in the antagonist's world. So that creates
the suspense.
Right.
Without, I feel like the opposite of that really is being just bombarded with all of this extra information.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Because it takes away from what is really important in the situation and what's really going to be intriguing.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So, yeah, I think that it totally creates a lot of the suspense in the Prince Caspian film, is that you have that glimpse of like what's going on at the palace. Then now you're anticipating something bad happening. Same with like Edmund and the witch. He's constantly like, you see him give her a piece of information. Now you're like, oh, that's going to have consequences when we go back to the other characters. Right. So it's like that nice, again, the cause and effect being carried throughout, using the cause and effect to create suspense.
Yeah, exactly.
And a sense of impending doom. Mm-hmm. So to recap, inciting incidents.
You can have more than one.
You can have more than one, and it can have different, it can be a nice layered cake.
Yeah, of like pulling you in and pulling you a little further and pulling you a little, pulling you further.
Right.
And then the characters have to make a decision. Like I always recommend the 3-act story structure to writers. I use it. It's tried and true. It's awesome. But once you know the rules, you can bend them a little bit. And I hate to even use the word rules because it's not even like hard and fast rules. It's just they're principles, really. That the principle, the thing behind the thing is the proof that it works and that it's actually engaging. And it has a psychological response to engage you in a story. So once you have like, okay, I know the formula of a good inciting incident. It has to push the characters outside their comfort zone. It has to challenge their beliefs. It has to push them into the realm of being a little bit intimidated by what's going on because of their desire, fear, and misbelief. Okay, now we can have a few of those things. We can stack them up, like the example here.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and then you have the nice cause and effect that follows that. You have the inciting incident, which then kind of is the first domino to fall that then hits the next one and the next one and the next one. And you can see clearly how they're all, in a very straightforward way, related to each other.
Yeah.
And how that first one was the first domino and like, now I can like go backwards and see it all play out and it makes total sense. And it's just a very satisfying method of storytelling.
Yeah.
Very satisfying tool that you can use.
Yeah.
That just, it's that page turner effect.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Exactly.
Internal conflict is awesome. And your characters can have almost the same internal conflict. And they can be, you can play with where is the internal conflict rooted from. It's not even so much that it's like, that's the same struggle that so-and-so is having. Well, it's like, no one is the same. Every person is as different as a fingerprint. So even though it might be the same internal conflict, it all comes from different places.
And that can be a really cool tool to use for comparing and contrasting how similar misbeliefs and similar conflicts and identity crises can sprout from different places, even like the complete opposite backstories.
Exactly.
It's very interesting.
It is super interesting. And world building. Don't feel the need to info dump everything. Don't feel intimidated by the density of what you've created. Whether it's the world or a magic system or a government system, let the readers, let the viewers find out about this through the character and through dialogue and through conversations and through the plot itself. And I mean, I can't really think of a story that has denser world building than Narnia. And that goes on for so many books. It's
it does.
It's amazing. And so that's a lot to be revealed. And it's revealed very artfully in a very deep point of view method. Keep it deep point of view. Don't feel like you need to kind of jump out of the character's skin to explain it all real quick.
Yeah. What immediately impacts the main character? That's really all you need to tell the reader is what is immediately impacting the main character right now.
Right.
That's it. That's all we need to know. That's all we need to know. And then in the next scene, what's immediately impacting them now? Okay, we can learn about that now.
Exactly.
So those are some of the awesome principles, storytelling tools that we've personally noticed in the series, The Chronicles of Narnia. So if you've read the series or watched the films, comment below if you're watching, or send us a message and let us know if you've seen the films or read the books and what you noticed, the certain storytelling principles you've noticed, or what you think of the ones we just went over.
Yeah, definitely. We all love to fangirl over Narnia together.
Yeah,
So.
Narnia is, like we said, one of our favorites of all time, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome storytelling. And if you haven't read the books and you haven't seen the films, what are you waiting for?
Yeah, for real.
Such good storytelling. Amazing.
So good.
So tell us what you think of this episode. We would love to hear from you. Tell us about your writing projects too. Tell us what you're working on. We'd love to cheer you on. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to go to our Patreon, which can be found at
patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show. All words, no ampersand. The Kate and Abbie Show.
Yes.
And you can support the podcast there and also connect personally with us. DM us your show requests and topics that you would like us to cover. So all kinds of good stuff there on the Patreon. Definitely check it out. And otherwise, share the podcast with a friend, a fellow Narnia fan. This episode would be great for them.
And if you are listening to this episode and you are like, hey, I want to see those story examples, again, it's youtube.com/KMNs. You will see the playlist. It's called The Kate and Abbie Show podcast episodes. Just find that episode and give it a watch. You're going to love the story examples we used. Thank you guys so much for listening. We're so glad you did. And we hope it's inspired you. And we will see you in the next episode. Stay stoked.
Rock on.